Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 10th, 2024. Happy debate day. Today we are going to be talking about the battleground state of North Carolina and 3 back-to-back polls that show good news for Vice President Kamala Harris in this battleground state. North Carolina has been on the radar for the Democratic Party ever since the 2020 election when they lost the state by a margin of just 1.3%, a reduction in support for Donald Trump when he won it in 2016 by 3.7%. In the 2020 election, North Carolina was a target state for the Biden campaign, but they knew that it would not be a state that flipped before Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and arguably even Arizona, Georgia, which are all states that Donald Trump won in the 2016 election that 4 years later went to Joe Biden. North Carolina is a state the Democrats also have been looking at for potential opportunities for victory in the 2012, 2016, and 2020 elections because of the 2008 presidential election, when they took the state of North Carolina, which went to George W. Bush, by 12.4% and turned it into a state that Barack Obama was able to win by 14,000 votes and defeated John McCain again in a state that we saw George W. Bush win 4 years prior by 12 points. North Carolina is a state that also, extending beyond the presidential, is a state that Democrats really do care about because there are always competitive races, whether it's a Senate race that is close, a governor's race the Democrats are currently holding on to, or multiple House races the Democrats have looked to as prime opportunities for pickups and maintaining their advantage in some of these battleground districts. North Carolina, back in 2020, went to Governor Roy Cooper, the Democrat, by 4.5%, but this presidential election looks more promising for Democrats in North Carolina for a variety of different reasons. When it comes down to Kamala Harris's candidacy, she has completely revived the Democratic base in North Carolina, and the polls show one piece of the story, but a major part of it. The Real Clear Politics average of Trump versus Biden had Donald Trump ahead against Joe Biden by 5.4% on average. This is massive. This is massive. Looking at this 5.4% margin for Trump, this would have indicated a blowout in North Carolina and many victories for Republicans down ballot and across the United States. Today, against Kamala Harris, Donald Trump leads by just 0.1%. He is holding on by a fraction of a percent, 0.1% here, 0.1% in the advantage in those 3 recent polls here. We see the Morning Consult poll, we see the Quinnipiac poll, we see the Survey USA poll, which on FiveThirtyEight does, in fact, have Kamala Harris in the advantage in North Carolina for the first time in a very long time, and also the first time ever when compared to that of President Joe Biden. And so looking at these 3 recent polls here, the one that I would say is the least strong for Kamala Harris is the one that shows her in a tie against Donald Trump. But I still believe this to be an improvement because of where it was back in 2020. What we remember about the 2020 election is that North Carolina was a state the Democrats did heavily invest in, but again, they were not counting on to win on Election Day. It's a state the Democrats haven't been able to tap into since Barack Obama, and of course, is a state that Kamala Harris might have a unique opportunity of turning out voters because of the fact that she has rejuvenated the Democratic Party's enthusiasm and support across college campuses, a huge part of the North Carolina Democratic voting electorate, across black and brown communities, a huge part of the Democratic Party voting electorate in the state of North Carolina. If there was a perfect candidate to inspire multiple sides of the base in North Carolina, it would be Kamala Harris. And the polls are suggesting that she just might be the one. The one that I find to be the most impressive isn't even the Quinnipiac University poll, because you know I talk about them at length in many other videos. It is actually the Survey USA poll, which is an A+ rated pollster according to FiveThirtyEight, and they do good work. They have really good data points across many battleground states, and sure, they have missed their mark before, and in some cases, they do miss their mark, and you can tell ahead of an election. I don't think Kamala Harris will win in North Carolina by 3 points on Election Day. But what I do believe is that they are onto something, that North Carolina is far more competitive than Democrats might think or did think it was going to be. Kamala Harris might in fact be in the lead today in North Carolina as she comes into a presidential debate this evening and 2 campaign stops this week in the battleground state. North Carolina being within reach for Kamala Harris is one thing. Being in the advantage is the other. And when you take a look at our 2024 electoral map, this is actually the map from 2020 with 2024 electoral map vote count. North Carolina going to the Democratic Party could be the slam dunk they need to expand on Joe Biden's 306 electoral votes. But it isn't just about expanding off the Biden advantage that they had in 2020. This election, I actually think, is closer than the 2020 election. As close as the 2020 election felt, with 4 days of election week, it's going to be closer this time around. Which means I don't think Kamala Harris is going to be at 319 electoral votes, at least not right now. And so North Carolina being added into the fray, now with her being in the advantage, actually puts her in a stronger position in North Carolina than what we are seeing in some other battleground states, which might surprise you. When you look at a state like Arizona, Donald Trump has a 0.8% advantage across this battleground state. This is a state that Biden won, and yet Kamala Harris is winning in North Carolina by more. A big reason for that, largely, can be her association with the southern border and the immigration crisis. Voters in Arizona care a lot more about the southern border than voters in North Carolina. And what we are finding to be true is that in states like Nevada, Kamala Harris does have the advantage, but it is running roughly even with that of North Carolina. Again, a big indicator for that could largely be the southern border crisis. This is the southwestern region of the United States. Kamala Harris is really trying to dispel the narrative that she failed on the issue of immigration, because the Republicans have tried to make that the major point of her candidacy. But it isn't landing as well as they'd like, which is why these leads for Donald Trump, or even the small leads for Kamala Harris, aren't something that would be completely eroded because they were under Biden, because Kamala Harris is messaging differently and messaging more correct on this topic. And voters, of course, never blame the vice president as much as they blame the president. The good news for Democrats, they don't have a president running for re-election. And so when it comes down to Nevada, a state that Biden won by 2.4 and lost North Carolina by 1.7, again, this could be an indicator as to why her numbers are running roughly even with that of a red state from the 2020 election. But focusing back on the state of North Carolina, what it does electorally is give Democrats additional avenues to 270. It isn't necessarily just about North Carolina adding in to being this massive state for Democrats, boosting their electoral vote count. No, it could be the Hail Mary that they need in a time where maybe they're losing some other battleground states. For instance, if we take a look at the 538 average, we just saw Arizona had Donald Trump ahead in Georgia. Donald Trump leads by 0.5. So if we were to take the polls at face value, this is the electoral map we'd be working with. 246 electoral votes for Donald Trump and 292 for Kamala Harris. But the one the Democrats are really worried about is the state of Pennsylvania, which has shown some tightening, which actually ended up being the best state for Biden throughout the polling season, and now one of the states that seems to be moving a bit away from Kamala Harris. In Wisconsin, Kamala Harris maintains a lead of 2.8%. In Michigan, Kamala Harris maintains a lead of 1.8%. In Pennsylvania, that state is largely going to be the closest, and honestly, too, based on investments and time and resources, Pennsylvania should be the closest state for the Trump team. Why? This is a state that they've invested $70 million in. Across the other battleground states, you take out states like Wisconsin and Michigan, you look at North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, they're not investing nearly as much. In fact, if you just take away actually Georgia, because that's the bigger cash dump for the Trump campaign, you take away Georgia, you combine the spending in Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, these 5 battleground states combined, the Trump team is spending less across those 5 states than they are in Pennsylvania. So they are hounding Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania, and Democrats are matching, right? They are spending equal amounts of the Republican campaign and outpacing Republicans everywhere else, especially in North Carolina, where the Trump team has invested less than $10 million in an effort in that state because the infrastructure wasn't there. They never thought they were going to lose it against Biden because, quite frankly, they weren't. And so they had to do a lot of last-minute rushing into the state. Democrats bought up a lot of the ad reservations. They are spending a lot more money than Republicans in North Carolina. And when they are cash-strapped, and the Trump team, which raised a lot of money after the mugshot was released, after the conviction was done, after the assassination attempt, after the RNC, Republicans have sort of tapped out on their fundraising advantages. Now, Democrats hold a $200 million plus cash on hand advantage against the Trump team, and that makes a difference. It makes the Trump team have to focus their resources. If Democrats are spending $80 million in Pennsylvania, so do Republicans, which means they now have less money for these other battleground states, and that's what we're seeing here. That North Carolina is one of those states where Republicans don't have enough money to invest the resources, and quite frankly, out of the 7 battleground states, it was the best for Trump in the 2020 election. And in theory, if there was any state he was going to be able to win without investing heavy resources, it should be North Carolina. But I still believe we are seeing the direct impact of Kamala Harris's unique focus on North Carolina. It is unheard of that a Democratic candidate is visiting North Carolina as much as Kamala Harris did. Even going back to Barack Obama, you did not see this as heavy. The North Carolina campaign, I would argue, was stronger for Barack Obama, but This is a very different election, very different type of circumstances. Now digital is at the forefront of everything. Campus voting will be just as important as it was in 2008 and just as important as it has ever been. If you're a college student, I hope you're watching this and I hope you're voting in this election. Looking at North Carolina, unique with Kamala Harris's campaign. She can do well in this state, and that's what the data is reflecting. So back to that point of multiple pathways to the presidency, North Carolina opens up an opportunity that if Donald Trump wants to spend $100 million more in Pennsylvania and he wins the state, he still doesn't win the presidency. You are finding that North Carolina could provide that safeguard. The Democrats, assuming they lose Arizona and Georgia, which is assuming a lot at this point, assuming that they lose Florida, Ohio, and Iowa, which isn't assuming too much. I think that's more fair than not. That's assuming that you have this combination of effects here. The Democrats just so happen to hold on to the states like North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And while this would be probably a really ugly electoral map, it wouldn't be too shocking given the current state of the race. Right now, Pennsylvania, though, is a Kamala Harris state, which means based on the polls, this is the current state of the race. Not as impressive as the 2016 or 2020 electoral vote margins, but it's a victory regardless. And it's a victory that Democrats would be happy with. A victory because a victory is something the Democrats did not even see in the realm of possibility just 2 months ago. And so Kamala Harris being at this point, where North Carolina is also standing to be a state that she could win. Mark my words when I say this. I believe if she's winning North Carolina, she's winning the election and winning many other battleground states too, likely including, I'm not going to say it's bounded, right? Because I think in 2020 we made that mistake. We assumed if Georgia was going, North Carolina would have to be going, but it's a different circumstance here. Georgia has been a little bit more against voting for the Democratic Party, but what's unique to North Carolina is that in their down ballot races, Republicans are collapsing. On the presidential, we've talked very high level about the Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden candidacies that have really dictated the narrative about what matters in these battleground states. But unlike Georgia, and unlike Arizona, and unlike many other battleground states, North Carolina has a very, very interesting, fascinating governor election. One that Democrats can likely ride into an electoral college victory in this battleground state. And you might be wondering, why is it that this governor's race is so close? Shouldn't it be just as competitive as the presidential level? Well, so you'd think. Mark Robinson, the incumbent lieutenant governor, on paper, seemed like he could be a strong candidate. But he ended up being far too extreme for the country, far too extreme for the voters in North Carolina. In the initial stages of the campaign, Donald Trump backed him. Republicans pulled out of the race and said that Mark Robinson should undoubtedly be the nominee for governor across North Carolina. They saw him as a rising star in the GOP, ignoring all of the things he had said and done in the past. One look at his Wikipedia page, and I mentioned this a lot, one look at his Wikipedia page can tell you exactly why he's a bad candidate in North Carolina and any swing state for that matter. Mark Robinson took the race from being one that was absolutely winnable for Republicans, where he, in fact, himself was in the advantage, to now Josh Stein and the Democratic Party raising millions of dollars to use these advertisements of Mark Robinson's own words against him. Most of these ads contain just verbiage from Mark Robinson's statements, Mark Robinson's recordings, Mark Robinson's public appearances. They have used his own words against him. What we have seen is a near total collapse in terms of support across the state for Mark Robinson. So when we take a look at North Carolina, while Kamala Harris might have that narrow advantage, leading by 0.2%, in the governor's race, we are seeing that Josh Stein in recent polls is up double digits, if not ahead, by massive margins. And in these recent polls here, Quinnipiac University that showed Kamala Harris with that 3-point advantage, Josh Stein leads by 10 and 12 points amongst likely voters. Massive, massive margins, largely driving Democratic Party turnout specific to this governor's race that translates to performances up the ballot in favor of Kamala Harris. That's why this matters. This race again went from being a state that in the early stages was very winnable for Republicans. We can see that earlier on, Mark Robinson had this advantage. We saw that back in January, ignore these polls here, these are primary polls, he was not ahead by 40 points. In the head-to-head, he was ahead by a point. Some showed that Josh Stein was doing strong, but still, Robinson ahead by a point, right? Robinson was leading. Robinson ahead by 5 points. Josh Stein started taking a lead by 2 points, 3 points, but then it started to reverse. Robinson ahead by 2 points. Then they started investing. The primary happened here. Democrats started investing more and more. Then after Biden came into the fray as a weaker candidate in North Carolina, his numbers started to drop across the state. You can see they hadn't always been super strong, but 4-point lead ended up being a 5-6 point lead. What we saw in North Carolina, the governor's race narrowed up until this point when Democrats got Kamala Harris on the ballot. And what happened? In just around a month, the lead started to expand dramatically. New York Times, Santa College, A-plus pollster. Survey USA, A-plus pollster. Josh Stein was dominating. And what that meant was now Democrats were doing much better in North Carolina. And what that meant was now Kamala Harris was doing much better in North Carolina. And so all in all, what we're finding is that North Carolina is this state that has largely been a sleeper for Democrats and Kamala Harris, and something that Republicans had long felt that this was going to be an easy hold in the 2024 election. And to be fair, under the Biden versus Trump matchup, they would have been correct. But today, it's very different. Democrats set up the infrastructure under Biden, and now Kamala Harris is exercising it. Republicans never even had the infrastructure to begin with because, again, they didn't think it would be competitive to start. Now Kamala Harris is visiting North Carolina twice this week. She's going to Greensboro and Raleigh. She's visiting the important parts of the state where you need to drive Democratic Party turnout. And now Kamala Harris takes an advantage in the recent 2 polls, high-quality polls, in the state of North Carolina, meaning the pathway to 270 for Kamala Harris has expanded. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.